And joining us now is Jill LeClair. She is founder of an organization called Global Disability Research in Sport and Health and is an anthropologist on leave from Humber College. And we're grateful you came into TVO tonight.
Thank you.
We should just explain, you're wearing the neck brace because you were in a car accident many years ago, and this will help you, not that the next 15 minutes of your life are going to be painful, but this will make it a little less painful, right?
Yes.
Okay. Let's go back to the origins of sports for people with disabilities. I gather it goes back to just after World War II. So fill us in on the history of how this started.
Yes, there are some incidences of sport for persons with a disability in Europe and in England and different places, but really the beginnings of the modern sport seem to be in 1948, which was the same year as the Olympic Games in London, England, and a neurosurgeon decided to have an event parallel to the Olympics in the Stoke Mandeville Hospital for the veterans who'd been severely injured, spinal cord injury patients, and have a comparable parallel event.
And two countries participated back then?
Just England at that time.
Just England, and then Netherlands
in 52, yep.
Okay. And now today, we're getting ready for the Paralympics, and we're up to how many countries now?
I think it's supposed to be around 42.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's really grown by leaps and bounds, hasn't it?
Phenomenal,
yeah.
Yes.
How were the Paralympics, as we know them today, formed?
Well, what happened was in 1960, there was lobbying to have, in Rome, to have the Paralympic Games at the same time, and that's when the first name began. And then they grew and grew from then, and Canada's played quite an important role in their growth in the 1970s. And then a Canadian called Dr. Robert Stedward was the driving force behind amalgamating the different disability organizations to create one whole organization that dealt with sport, and then relate more closely to the Olympics and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee.
So it was 1960 when the Paralympics were held in the same year as the Olympic Games.
Yes.
But when did they start using the same facilities as they do right now?
1988 in Seoul.
Seoul, Korea.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. The difference between the Paralympics and the Special Olympics, what is it?
Yes, people often get confused with that. The Paralympics is are games, are events of elite athletes that train to be the best they can and compete against the best they can. And they have physical disabilities of different kinds. The Special Olympics is for people with intellectual disabilities, and their goal is to include as many children and adults and people as they can to compete in physical activities. So everybody gets a medal, everybody gets a ribbon, everybody is rewarded for participating. So they're quite different basis and different orientation.
And they don't have the games in the same facilities or the same year as the IOC has their games?
Totally separate. Although it has the name Olympics.
It does?
Yes.
Okay, now it was...
Kennedy. Yeah, the Kennedy family.
It was the Kennedys who did that.
Apparently one of the previous generation, I think there were 12 children or 10 or something, and one was intellectually disabled and was banished and not heard of, and that was very common in those days. So one of the sisters, Eunice, decided that she would start this, I think it was in the 60s, and sort of in honor of her sister and to recognize that people should be included.
And she just passed away a few months ago, I think.
Yes, sadly, yes.
Okay. Now, Paralympics, who can compete? We made the distinction a second ago, you did, between the Paralympics and the Special Olympics. Here's who can compete. We'll put up a chart here. In the Paralympics, you can compete if you're an athlete who has an amputation, spinal cord problems, cerebral palsy, a visual impairment, or something they call les autres, other problems as well. And let's just clarify who can compete against whom. For example, would you ever see an event at the Paralympics where you've got somebody who's blind competing against somebody who, for example, has a spinal cord injury?
No, the blind events are usually held separately, but it depends, it's a bit complicated on the sport. For example, in swimming, there used to be 4 separate teams if you went back to the 80s. So Canada would send off 4 different teams, the amputees in one group, cerebral palsy in another. And then what happened in the 90s was the decision was to make competition based not on the disability, but on sport-based. And so people with different disabilities were grouped together. So you could have somebody perhaps without a leg against somebody who has motor neural problems, against somebody who perhaps is very short, a dwarf.
In the same event?
In the same event. So if you stand and watch an event, and it's quite interesting for people who've never seen it, you might have somebody starting in the water or on the blocks, different shaped bodies, different size bodies. It's quite different from what we expect to see in the Olympics, where you can often guess which sport the athlete's competing against by the shape of their body. You know, if it's a runner, they tend to be tall and thin and lean, And if they're doing powerlifting, they tend to be short and muscular.
Or if they're a men's hockey player, they tend to have a gold medal around their neck. Oh, sorry, I'm just getting that in there. Has there been any controversy about this classification system that people are unhappy with?
Yes, there's different systems for different sports. So
Sorry, women's hockey player too. I should, just in the interest of fairness.
I didn't like to interrupt.
Hockey. No, I mean, you should have done it, but anyway.
Well, and you know what people are hoping for? There'll be a three-peat. So we'd have gold for the men, gold for the women, and gold for sledge hockey.
Yeah.
Yes, coming up. So I hope everybody's going to watch, right, and cheer them on. So that's what everyone's hoping for, a three-peat.
Controversy over the classifications.
Yes. So in swimming, what happened was we now have one Canadian team, and you have different athletes with different disabilities competing together. But it varies by sport, and it's a little bit complicated because some sports are more medically based, which was it used to be in the past. You'd be clumped by disability. So it's quite complicated. And sometimes people get a bit confused because you'll have different events because the athletes are classified differently. For example, in swimming, if you're severely disabled, you'd be in a different group from, say, if you were only a lower leg amputee. So the same event is held again.
Okay.
So you have more than one medal.
Here's a bit of an odd question. We know that dozens of athletes were prohibited from participating in the Olympic Games just concluded because they cheated. Do Paralympians cheat?
Well, I think in every sport, sadly, that is an issue. But in terms of the classification issue, it's quite rigorous in terms of how you assess the athlete. So, for example, taking swimming, continue with that example, you have an examination on land and to see how much somebody can move their arms, and if they've got a missing part of their leg, it's measured and so on. That's part one of the evaluation. Part two is in the water to see how they swim, but part three is to see how they function, because it's all to do with how you function within the sport in competition. So the classifiers, who are the people who assess you, are seeing your actual performance. So it's not really going to do you any good because it'll be immediately apparent.
But I presume all of the restrictions against doping that take place in the IOC's games are here as well.
Yes, they have to go and do doping, protocols for doping. It's the same. So, for example, our Canadian team, they have to know exactly what's expected and follow the rules and expect that they might be tested. Yeah.
And as soon as you win a medal, do they take you off to the lab and make you pee in a bottle the way they do at the IOC
Oh, yeah, it's taken
games?
very seriously, yes.
Huh, okay. Here's a letter to the editor I want to read to you that was in the International Herald Tribune very recently. In ancient Greek, para means alongside, but the Paralympics don't run alongside the Olympics, they run afterward. And the 2-week gap between the games is a long one. In that time, the majority of the world's media disappears, the cheering crowds return home, and the host city returns to normal. How is this equality? How does this bestow the proper respect and attention on these world-class athletes? Rather than offering disabled athletes their very own arena in which to shine, the Paralympics seem to set on a dimmer switch in contrast to the brightness of the Olympic torch. You want to react to that?
Yeah, that's a big debated issue at the moment. There are quite a lot of researchers and people active in the disability community and the sport community that feel exactly as this writer said in the paper, that they really would be better if the two events were merged together, although logistically people recognize that would be a problem, instead of having really, it's viewed as a two-tier system. And if you want the best in the world, whether it's non-disabled or disabled, then they should be treated equally. So it is a big debate at the present time.
Well, where do you fall on it?
In an ideal world, I think it'd be wonderful to have integration. I mean, I'm not saying there wouldn't be some challenges. Certainly cost is one.
When you say integration, do you mean everybody competing against everybody in every event?
Well, I mean, that would be wonderful. But I think realistically, if you had them held at the same time, extend the length. And I know that would be problematic in terms of size and so on, but I think that was in an ideal world, and certainly a number of people are arguing for that and saying it would be more in the genuine spirit of Olympism, because then you would have whoever is excellent in all aspects of sport, instead of having, as some people feel now, that it really is a two-tier system.
Right. We know that billions, literally billions of people watch these Vancouver Olympic Games just completed. We also know that billions of people will not watch the Paralympic Games. But who does watch?
I think quite a lot of people watch now, if they can find coverage. For example, in Beijing and in Athens, you could watch on the local television and they had live coverage. Well, my understanding is that here in Canada for the Paralympics, for the Winter Paralympics, they're going to have a little bit of live coverage perhaps, but most of it will be like a summary at the end of the day. So it's hard to get people engaged if you can't follow the whole way along. But I think you get lots of people following for the same reasons, I would argue, that a lot of people watch the Olympic Games, for the human interest stories as well as the sport performance. I think one of the things that is amazing for a lot of people, if they've never seen a Paralympic sport, is to say, my goodness, how did that person do that? A small example, I was watching swimming with a friend who had accompanied me to assist me in Athens. And there's a Chinese swimmer called He, I hope I'm pronouncing it, H-E, and he hasn't arms or shoulders, and he was going to jump into the pool with other athletes that looked quite considerably more able than him, and my friend said, how is he possibly going to swim across the pool? And he won, he gold medaled. And I think that's another contribution to the Paralympic Games, is that people nearly always underestimate you if you have a disability. It's just how it is.
Well, given the disability, the achievements that these athletes do is, in some respects, even more impressive than what the so-called able-bodied Olympians achieve.
Well, and it's, I think, pushing the boundaries of what we expect, whether it's Oscar Pistorius, he's the athlete with
double amputee.
Yes, yeah. And is, you know, running nearly as fast as Olympic runners who are non-disabled. So I think that whole issue and appeal of the Olympic Games is also found in the Paralympic Games, of people doing things that seemed impossible and are impressive.
To that end, I want to show you some video here. Now, this is not from an Olympic-sanctioned sport, but this is pretty incredible. Here's Aaron Fotheringham in a piece of tape that ESPN put together. It's really hard to call this guy disabled when you can see what, in fact, he achieves. Let's take a look at this. Roll tape, please.
People call it wheelchair skateboarding, and that's just like, oh man, it's its own sport.
A sport Aaron calls hardcore sitting. Essentially creating a new sport, Aaron had an idea for a new trick, one he believed had never been achieved by anyone in a wheelchair.
People keep coming up to me and saying it'd be cool if I could do a backflip on my wheelchair. I want to try it.
After countless falls and brutal crashes, on July 13th, 2006...
That's just amazing that he would have the guts to even try that. But here's the kind of, here's the flip side of the argument. You wanted integrated games. You'd love to see everybody competing against everybody. Should so-called able-bodied people, you know, if that ever were to become an Olympic sport, be able to compete against Aaron if they can walk and run, but they decide, this looks like a neat thing to try, maybe I'll get in the wheelchair and see if I can flip it too?
Well, I think it depends on the sport. For example, some people said with blind athletes, you know, and running, but apparently the motor elements when you're blind and walking are different because you have to feel the ground because you can't see in the same way. So what might appear to be a level playing field might not be. That's one concern I would have. But I think your issue, and I think it's a really good question about what is the meaning of disability, is the core of that. And again, with some of our Canadian athletes, can perform much better than a non-disabled person. So what does the meaning of disability mean? Which is why some members of the disabled community don't like the word, because they say, I focus on what I can do and I'm excellent at this, so why are you giving me this label? On the other hand, we have people all around the world, and members of our group, for example, in low-income and middle-income companies are claiming the word disability because they're trying to get the government to recognize they need to get to school. The children don't get to school, let alone play games in a formal sense. And they're saying they want to use that word to say we want our disability rights. So you have a lot of tension around the meaning of what does disability really mean? Well,
we had a very sad example in the Vancouver Games with Brian McKeever, right? This skier of ours who's, I guess, legally blind. He's 90% blind. And he wanted a chance to, he's a great skier, wanted a chance to compete, and I guess at the end of the day his time just wasn't quite as good as the other four. And therefore, and you could only have four, so he didn't get his chance. He's going to compete in these games, obviously. Do you see any issues, though, arising over attempts to kind of cross-fertilize isn't the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say here.
Yes, well, I think it's new. So, and I think another piece of that is technology, right? where does technology play? And I don't mean just in things like, say, swimsuits that clearly gave people an edge, but what does it mean if people use technology that is attached to their body? And so I think a lot of these issues we're not sure because it's so new. Where does it go? What does it mean?
Given that he's 90% blind, he's legally blind, right?
Yeah.
He's 90% blind, he's got 10% sight. Some people would argue he shouldn't even have been allowed to compete in these so-called able-body Olympic Games, that his place really should be in the Paralympics. What do you say to those folks?
Well, perhaps it's a little bit like we see in women in sport, where you have some events that are for women only and some that are integrated. Perhaps we need to do the same thing.
I can think of only one sport in any Olympics that's integrated men and women. I think it's equistrian, but I can't think of anything
sailing,
else.
I think.
Sailing?
Sailing,
okay,
I think.
maybe that's another.
Yeah, but I meant
it's not a long list.
Yeah, I suppose.
I don't mean to be a bummer here, but it's not a long list.
No, you're right. Yeah.
If he were the fastest, I presume he would have had a chance to participate in those games just concluded, but he wasn't. And some people thought, shame on our team for not giving him a shot, even though he wasn't the fastest.
Yeah, I saw some of the articles in the paper. People were saying, why not give him a chance? It would have been wonderful if he had. I think it'd be very interesting.
Great story, but he'll have his chance now.
Yeah.
Yeah, he will. Where's, we've seen amazing development in the Paralympics from when it started, sort of 1960, to where we are today. It's huge. Torch was, run into the House of Commons the other day, just as the torch for the other games was as well. Take us 25 years down the road. Where do you see this thing ending up?
Oh, gee, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I would hope that at all levels of sport for persons with a disability, there'd be more opportunities, because at the moment, if you live in Toronto, you have many more, and this is also true for non-disabled, many more opportunities. And there's still difficulties in accessing buildings, there's still difficulty in getting access to events, getting coaches and so on. So I think we'll probably see a lot more opportunities at all different levels. And on the issue of the science and the technology around the body, I don't know. I think we can't imagine. I mean, take something simple as a cell phone. I mean, I think most of us couldn't imagine when we were, say, 10, that people would be walking around. That was sort of like science fiction. And now everybody does it routinely all around the world. So perhaps with all the, the adding on parts and using different metals and different technologies, perhaps a kind of integration of cyborg bodies, as people call them, a mixture of the non-human with the human. Maybe we'll have a different sports. Now, there are some people who argue that transplant games should be included in, that's another whole discussion.
Beam me up, Scotty. This is getting very science fiction. Jill, it's so good of you to come into TVO tonight and help us with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me.